Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. So this week we're going to build up this Cervelo P3 time trial bike. It's an absolute dream build, this one. Lovely carbon fibre frame in beautiful condition. We've been presented with this frame and also the rider's previous race bike. So we're going to strip that bike down, this beautiful giant Trinity, an older aluminium frame, so he's going from aluminium to the carbon fibre frame. But we treat this very much like we would any other full rebuild service, in that these parts will be taken off of this bike, they'll be cleaned up, lubricating them, putting them back onto the new frame and getting that built up nicely so that he continues racing. So initially we're going to strip the bike down. Obviously this is going right back to frame with everything coming off it ready for the new build. So we'll get all the components off of this one, including this bottom bracket here. So this comes off, we've got that lovely tool there that really grips the teeth on the bottom bracket itself and really helps take that off nicely. We're cutting the cables because we're not going to reuse those. We'll be putting fresh cables through there. We'll be using our super slick cables, and as you can see from this bike had a wax chain on it and there wasn't an awful lot of debris or build up on the drivetrain itself, but we'll clean that off anyway and get a new wax chain on this bike as well, which you'll see that process. So we're also getting off all the brakes, everything's coming off. Fortunately for us, this bolt that often seizes inside there came off nicely, so that wasn't a problem. And you can see again with the brakes, a bit of debris and build up, so we'll get those cleaned up. Bottle cages, every fitting and fitment off of this frame ready for the build. The only thing we didn't actually reuse was those blue spacers and bearing cap, because obviously it wouldn't have matched the black of the new Cervelo frame, so we used a new spacer and a new cap on there. So we're stripping down everything for ultrasonic cleaner. The chainring we're actually changing for a larger chainring. He wanted to go to a 60-tooth chainring, which will allow a straighter drive line on his chain itself, which will just help with less drag on the chain, a little bit more efficiency on the drivetrain itself. So this is all now gone through the ultrasonic cleaner. So we'll wash that degreaser off in warm soapy water as we're using here, and we get the brakes cleaned up and washed down. The chain set here cleaned up and washed down. We're using one of our nylon detailing brushes just to wash that off. Nylon detailing brush here again with all the little fixtures and fittings, and then just a little sponge wipe on the saddle itself, avoiding that light that's on there, trying to make sure that doesn't get too wet or spoil. So we just wash down some of these bits with a sponge and some of the detailer. Now a little trick here on the jockey wheels, these have previously been waxed, so we're actually using a furniture polish here to wipe that wax off. It just somehow really efficiently works with breaking down the wax that has built up on those jockey wheels. It's just one of those little tricks. And then we're just using a little bit of Loctite 222 here on the jockey wheels just to make sure that they're locked into the derailleur itself before rebuilding. And then we'll start our lubricating process. So a little bit of copper slip on the threads, a little bit of general purpose grease on the thumb adjuster. That is always a good practice. We do that on the brakes and the derailleurs. We use our thin all-purpose oil on the pivot points, which makes a noticeable difference in freeing them up and actuating smoothly. And then we're also using our premium grease on the spring just to stop that going rusty. And again, copper slip on the thread of the thumb adjuster for the brakes. A little bit of general purpose grease on the top where the actual head of the thumb adjuster sits, so that it just all spins nicely and doesn't corrode into the bike. And again, a little bit of thin oil on the pivot points of the brake, and even a little bit of silicone grease there on the slider for the brake. Now these syringes, we actually offer these on our website now. Anybody who did order last week on our first week of the website, thank you very, very much for your orders. And if you are interested in buying some of these syringes or any of the other products you see on these videos, please do check out our website, bikespeeds.com. The link is in the description below. We use our copper grease on the chain set bolts, then our general purpose grease on the pedal arm so that it doesn't corrode together with the chainring. So we're getting this nice 60-tooth chainring back on the bike now. This is a slightly larger one than the one that came off, again as I mentioned, to straighten up his drivetrain, but that's a big boy, that one. You've got to have some strong legs to pedal that in a race. I wish our rider the very best, and I hope he improves his times on this bike, which I'm sure he will, because it is an absolute dream build, this one. So we're using the Autoglim Super Resin Polish. Again, that's available on our website. We find this a lovely creamy polish. It's a beautiful polish to use on bikes. It just really works on these sort of lacquered frames or frames that have a gel coating on them. It really polishes them up. Wipe that off with a microfiber towel, microfiber tails don't scratch, and they're just very soft, and they're just beautiful rags to polish off with without damaging the bike. And then we're just going to use the Auto Glim Rapid Ceramic Spray. This will just stop road debris and film and wet weather spoiling this frame in any way. It will wash off far easier with a ceramic coating on it, and it also really makes that polish that we've already put on really pop out and gives us a beautiful reflection on the frame. So we've done the maximum we can with this frame to really energize it and make it look great. Now the disc wheel that he gave us, he also wanted a new tyre on there. This is the old-fashioned tubular tyre, so this needs to be glued onto the wheel itself. But the first step here is to prep for chain waxing in the ultrasonic cleaner. I wash the cassette off once it's out. We need this to be completely degreased so that it's nice and clean for the waxing process. We also degreased, we had a new chain, but we actually degreased that first before we waxed it, because he rides wax chains on his bikes. So we've now put that through the wax. We'll let that dry, break down the wax to make it nice and flexible again, which we're doing there now. And then we're just using the molten speed powder. For me, it's a final detail on the bikes that I'm presenting, just to give them that final finish that's maybe just that little bit extra from what you would maybe do with a general waxing at home. Just a nice presentation thing, but it's supposed to offer a few extra watts and a little bit less friction on the chain, and it's a good process to do that as a final touch. Now I'm just gluing up the tubular tyre that's going to go on this bike. So we follow the instructions that's on the glue itself, whereby we give 2 coats to the tyre and 1 coat to the rim with the set timings between before we actually bond this. So this is actually a bit of a time delayed shot on the video there, but we just follow the instructions with the glue that's on the tyre and get that on. It's always a wrestling match to get a tubular tyre onto a wheel. If you've ever ridden a tubular tyre, they're a beautifully smooth ride and they corner great. Such a pleasurable tyre to ride on in comparison with modern tubeless tyres, or indeed tyres with an inner tube in. There is something very nice about riding a tubular tyre. They're a bit of an old-fashioned technology now, but they are a joy to ride, and I've always enjoyed riding tubular tyres. So I'm sure this rider will enjoy this wheel on his new carbon fibre frame. We'll also just give him that a polish up as well, just to really get the details nice, just to make this bike really pop out when he picks it up. A little bit of general purpose grease on the hub before putting the cassette on. That'll stop it bonding with dissimilar metals and corrosion moving forwards through the bike's life. It makes it easier to remove that in the future. And then we're getting the saddle on. Now I have measured the height of his saddle and the distance from the cap of the steerer tube there to the tip of the saddle, and I got that roughly to within where his original bike was, and obviously he can now tune that fitment to his own riding and how he's feeling with the bike. So plenty of copper slip on this bolt here, because they're notorious for bonding in the frames, so I make sure that that's well lubricated for that. And then we actually left, you can see here, the original cables on these bars when we took them off the other bike, so that they would help me guide through these new cable outers and the new cables into this bike. We had to use a magnet there just to feather the cables through the frame, and then we're actually using this foam tube to go over the cable outers, because that will just stop them rattling inside the frame. It's something I always do when I build a bike, whether it's a standard cable through or an outer through the frame, or even Di2 cables. Occasionally I will put that on them where they're meeting junction boxes and things, just to stop that rattling through the frame when you're over rough terrain. It can make a huge difference. There's nothing worse than a frame that's rattling, so we make sure we put those on as well. I'm using the Park Tool cable guide here just to help me usher the cables through the frames in the small little areas, and then I can pull them back through, and then on I go in the brakes here. We're using our super slick cables here. Again, we do those brake kits on our website, but this cable is a lovely tightly wound stainless steel cable. It actually, because it's so tightly wound, they're marginally thinner than a standard cable, which means they glide in and out of the outers so beautifully, and they can give a lovely shift to a bike, way superior to standard cables. So we're using our super slick cables on the entire build of this. Now this has only got one shifter, because he's only riding a rear derailleur. He's not riding a front derailleur on this bike, because this is out and outright race bike, and we're actually living quite a flat area where we are. So these sort of bikes, it's not uncommon to see one by systems for TTing, because we don't need that smaller ring or larger ring on the front. We just tend to pick our specific gearing that was suited to us. And fortunately for us, even on this frame, the old frame had a screw-in bottom bracket, the new frame had this screw-in bottom bracket, so we didn't even have to replace the bottom bracket on this one. In fact, that was quite a new bottom bracket, I believe, so I hadn't done many miles, so we were able to even reuse the bottom bracket. In terms of extra parts on this build, from our perspective, it was almost like doing a detailing service. Stuff was coming from one bike to another. We had the cables, we had the chain, but the actual rebuild process was very similar to one of our rebuild services, really, so it was quite a pleasure to do. So we're getting on the cables, using copper slip in there on the frame riv nuts before putting the accessory parts on there, the bottle holder there. That will just stop those corroding together. You've got stainless steel screw going into an aluminium hole, so that's a good process to just use something on there to stop those two bonding together. Along goes our lovely wax chain. We're now starting to cut off the cables, get the new cable ends on, so the bike is really beginning to finish up now. Adjust the gears, do a few tweaks. We had a little high screw adjustment there to make, just to get that to drop into the first gear, and as you can see, that's now operating as smooth as it needs to. Then we just check the brakes, make sure that they're all okay, everything's okay there. So now we can actually shorten the cables. You can see there I use a little cable guide that gets both front and rear exactly the same length quite easily as I'm doing that. And then a final little detail, the sticker over the valve hole. This probably would have originally had a plastic fitting in there, but it just is a little subtle detail just to make it present well when I offer it to the customer. We're also just going to change out these stem bolts. They were quite rusty. Copper slip on there just to stop those bonding into the aluminium of the stem itself, because I'm now using stainless steel bolts there, so we want to make sure that everything is okay and moving forwards will not corrode. We torque those up, and that's just the detail that just makes the bike really look nice instead of a little bit of rust showing through after such a lovely and lengthy build to a bike. So now finally we can start torquing up the bike. So we go right through the bike and we check every torque setting on the bike just to make sure that everything is perfect when the bike goes out, and that he's going to ride this with no teething issues from the point of view of the parts and job that we've done. Now also, this little hole is notorious for building up with dirt and debris, so we're just going to put one of our vinyl detailing stickers over there just so that the dirt and debris can't get in that hole, and then that can just be peeled off if ever we need to take the brake off again and a new one added at a future time. So again, going through the bike, torquing up the rear end now, just making sure that's all perfect. And as you can see from this bike now, what a lovely machine this is. All presented nicely, everything clean, brand new wax chain, brand new cables. This bike is ready to leave the shop and race, and I wish the rider every success in his future racing on this bike. It was a pleasure to do. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do subscribe, and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.